Today I'm sharing a look at the amazing new Stencils 360 release from Penguin Palace Stamps. I made loads of cards with techniques ranging from beginner to advanced, and there's one little extra twist with the last one. Let's get started. First is the Diamonds Geo set. The packaging shows the two designs and examples so you can get a sense of what you can make, which is important since often you really can't tell just by looking at the stencil. This set has two 6-inch stencils, so I've got my 6-inch guide ready inside the base of the tool, and I tape my stencil to that, making sure the guideline with the arrow was at 12 o'clock, and the diamonds are pointing straight up and down. When I'm using these stencils, I generally prefer to use blending brushes rather than foam tools, since I find that the foam can get damaged on the edge of the stencils. When I've blended my first color through, I clean the stencil while it's in place, and then I turn the stencil and the guide ring so that the line with the arrow is now pointing at the next square. The squares are placed evenly around the base, so I'll get 24 shapes in my circle if I use that. And there are other shapes on the base that are wider apart, so you can get different looks with 16, 12, or 8 shapes in your design. I worked my way through my favorite Catherine Pooler rainbow twice until the whole design was filled in, and I got this fun design. Then I grabbed the other stencil in the set and I layered over the first layer using black ink. This goes faster because I'm only using one color and I don't have to clean the stencil each time I turn it. I usually love black with a rainbow of color, but when I looked at the result, it was a little too intense for me. So I quickly went back and I redid the design separately, both in rainbow colors this time. People often comment about the spirograph look of some of these designs, and this is definitely one of those times, especially that one with the thinner lines. I finished the first one with a chunky white "Hello There" die-cut sentiment, along with a small beautiful word from Sweet Ride, heat embossed on black cardstock. For the second card, I cut a black mat and I added a small missing you strip sentiment from Magical Christmas Sentiments. The next stencil is the Gerbera Daisies stencil. I didn't film this one, I just blended and turned 3 times. This time you want to turn it to every 4th circle to fill in the design. This is a beautiful wreath design that comes together so easily with absolutely no masking while you're blending. I added a popped-up sentiment from a new stamp set that I'll be coming back to later on. Next, I've got the Aster Charm Stencil set. It has 2 stencils, an 8-inch one for the flowers and a 6-inch one for the leaves. I'm showing you an easy way to create a different look than the intended look by moving the stencil slightly and just using one of the flowers. You can see that I've taped the stencil down only on one side of the guide ring, and the other side is not attached to the guide ring at all. I blended 3 colors of ink through to get a pretty blend from pink to yellow, and then I turned the stencil. Since I'm doing this on my own, I wasn't sure how far I needed to turn it to avoid overlap, so I just kept going until I was at a triangle mark, and this will give me a wreath of 8 of these flowers. I decided to go back and add some fuchsia at the base of each flower for a little extra drama, and that's easy to do by just lining up the line with the arrow with the triangle marks. Because I'm using the same inks each time, I don't have to clean the stencil as I'm turning, and I quickly finished my 8 flowers. To fill in the leaves, I grabbed the 6-inch stencil guide and the leaf stencil, and I lined up one of the leaves on the inside of the wreath. This time you can see that the stencil is hanging up over the top of the stencil guide, and only a small part of it is in the center of the design, but the principle is the same. The line with the arrow is at 12 o'clock, and I'll move that around to the triangles to fill in the leaves. I went round with green for all of them, and then I went backwards, adding a little blue at the base of each leaf for a little dimension and interest. To get some leaves on the outside of the wreath, I needed to use the 8-inch stencil guide. I taped the 6-inch stencil to the edge of the guide again, positioning the leaf where I wanted it between the flowers, and I followed the exact same steps. It looks a little awkward, and you need to be mindful of where the stencil is and isn't, so you don't end up with ink where you don't want it, but this is a really easy way to be able to customize your look. I continued on filling in the center of the wreath. This time where I put the leaf I wanted where I wanted it, the stencil wasn't touching the stencil guide at all. Looking at this now, I'm not sure why I didn't just get this 6-inch stencil guide back out, but this is another equally viable option. I grabbed a piece of cardstock to act as an extension, and I taped it to the top and bottom of the stencil guide, and then I was able to finish filling in the center of my wreath. So this design is quite different than what I would have gotten if I had just blended and turned as the design was intended, and I cut the wreath down to create 2 card front panels. I put the first one on an oyster card base with a small thanks sentiment, and the second one I used another die-cut sentiment in bold black, along with a bold black border on a white card base, And you can see how easy it is, even with the same panel, to get different looks depending on your finishing touches. Next up is the Radiance stencil. This one is big, bold, and just glorious. I blended that same rainbow of colors through using the circles as my marker this time, so I'll get 12 repeats of the design. I started with yellow so I didn't have to clean my stencil as I moved through orange, pink, and purple, but to get clear Fiesta blue, I cleaned off the fuchsia ink. They mixed to make a really pretty dark blue, but that wasn't the look I wanted. I cleaned it again after the blue to get a pure lime Ricky, and then it was done. I really liked the center of this one, but I felt like there was lots of space between each of the arms on the design. So I went back to my previous trick, and I positioned one of the arms so that it's coming from the edge of the stencil guide back into the center of the design. Whenever you start, you just want to make sure that you're lined with the arrows at the top so it's easy to keep track of your turning. And I turned this one 12 times to fill in all that white space with some gray ink. Well, there's no white space now, that's for sure. The nice thing about working with a big panel like this is now I have the choice of how to cut it down. In the end, I cut a rectangle from the center, and I cut a circle from the center of that, and I added a black hello there die cut. I added some white dots with a Posca paint pen to tie into the dots in the rainbow design. And of course, that circle from the center was perfect for making a second card. I popped it up with a big black circle mat, and I put it on a stenciled background I had made by blending ink through the 6-inch square porcelain stencil and then shifting and blending again. The next stencil is the Peacock accent stencil, and it has a matching stamp set. But I thought that the Radiance stencil would also make a pretty peacock tail, so I tried that instead. My first idea was to make a semicircle of Radiance feathers by not blending ink through anything underneath that center line. And I started with the Flirty Fuchsia before blending Fiesta Blue and Lime Ricky through. So at this point, I'm picturing kind of a fancy NBC peacock with a fan tail, and as I continued on, I blended ink only through that one side, since I don't want any feathers underneath the horizontal line. After I'd done 4 on that side, I decided because of the way the peacock is standing, he probably didn't even need a full semicircle, so I stopped there. The peacock is a 2-part stamp with a matching die, and it's often better to die cut before you stamp. If you stamp before you die cut, you may find that you haven't stamped the second stamp exactly in the right spot, and then the die cut doesn't quite fit anymore. I die cut the peacock from my panel, and then I placed it in my MISTI and lined up the first stamp in the hole. Then I put the die cut in, and I stamped the head and body with black ink. Then I lined up the wing and tail stamp, and I stamped that down as well, and because I knew where the edge of the die cut was when I positioned it, it's in the correct position. I hope that makes sense. I stamped the sentiment at the top of the panel, and I added a black frame to finish this one. Next, I grabbed the stencil that was designed to work with the peacock, and I decided to make it a non-peacock card and without turning the stencil. I put it down on my sticky mat, and I blended the warm colors of my rainbow onto my panel, just like a regular non-turning stencil, except of course it's round. Then I cleaned the stencil and I flipped it over before blending the cool colors of the rainbow through to create a mirrored design. For the sentiment, I used the same sentiment, but this time I performed some stamp surgery and trimmed off the inside and out portion of the stamp. You can use masking if you're not a fan of stamp surgery. To finish this one, I added a narrow black border to try and match the delicate fond in the sentiment, and I left lots of white space. Going back to the peacock stamp set, there's a 3-layer tail here as well, with a matching die. I noticed that the stamp and the die are the exact same size as the stencil, so if you wanted to stencil the design instead of stamping it, you could still cut it out with the die. I love it when coordinating products work together like this. For my final card, I stamped 2 of that tail design with 3 colors, and I die cut them out and popped them up on a white card with a thick black frame to match the weight of that die cut sentiment. 10 cards is a lot for me, but I always have so much fun with this tool. Which one's your favorite? I think I have maybe 2 or 3. Can you guess which ones? Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.